Welcome to this special episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. In today's episode, I'm joined by Josh Woodward, who participated in the Menzies Early Career Network. This unique network has offered university students across Australia a fantastic opportunity to engage with the history of the Menzies era, connect with like-minded peers and respected figures in the field of Australian political history. As part of their involvement in the program, our 2024 participants have contributed to a special project, writing chapters for our upcoming book, Finding Menzies, A New Generation's Inspiration for Foreign Affairs, Social Policy and Political Thought. In today's episode, we'll delve into Josh's experience in the network, the insights he's gained and how these have shaped the conversation around Menzies' enduring legacy to modern Australia. So Josh, your topic, your chapter is My John Citizen in Australia Believes in Peace, Freedom, Empire and the Ordinary Australian, which is, I think, a really intriguing chapter heading. What attracted you to this topic, Josh?
So my research interest is in tourism and 20th century travel and advertising. And Menzies always kind of loomed as a figure in the background that was connected to the institutions and leaders in these industries that I was or have been studying for quite a few years now. So then when I saw the call for papers and participation in the Early Career Network, I thought, here's a chance to explore this figure who's always sort of been loosely connected to what I'm doing, but not directly enough to include in my PhD or in the published articles that I've done. And I think at this time in Australia, in these institutions that are responsible for articulating a message and advertising a message about Australia overseas, there's this really positive notion that by promoting Australia, we can overcome difference and sort of connect with the world in a positive way. And when I found Menzies' 1935 Chatham Address, about which this chapter is, based on, that speech, I sort of saw that he was also articulating some of these ideas that people in the travel industry were proponents of. And I think it's a really positive aspect of interwar history that we might not otherwise know a lot about.
I think the evolution of Australia's identity, and as you say, this is sort of seen through the lens of how Australian tourist campaigns have promoted the Australian way of life, Australian identity. But Australian identity as it sort of evolves post-federation is fascinating. I mean, we don't get even a formal category of Australian citizenship until 1949, which is incredible. I mean, would have been a federation since 1901, and it takes until 1948 for the Chifley government to even pass legislation to create Australian citizenship. So before that, we are British subjects. So that connection between Britishness and Australianness is developing, and yeah, you've obviously looked at that. So tell me about, so Robert Menzies visits England for the first time ever in 1935. So he's 41 years old. He was born in 1894, although he's probably actually 40 years old because his birthday is the 20th of December. So I'm going to assume he hadn't had his birthday by the time he went to England. But this is amazing to think this is a person who's quite he's an Anglophile. He says, I'm British to my bootstraps, and yet he doesn't visit the mother country until he's really in middle age. So, I mean, tell me about this experience of him going to England and what his reactions are to it.
So it's really interesting that he has these preconceptions about England really before he arrives there. But I think in quite a short time, he's confronted by a kind of dissonance between the England he encounters, which is a really in the midst of a really tumultuous political situation, coping with uh, the economic difficulties of the past, but also looking forward to what we now know, and they of course didn't know then, to be the outbreak of another European and global conflict. So in the midst of that, Menzies, who has these preconceptions about Britain and quite a romantic idea about Britain and where Australia fits into the British political community, sort of finds that people on the ground there perhaps advancing the British local interests more than what Menzies imagines to be a more global imperial interest. So Menzies, I think, feels and in his diary and in his speeches in that time records that Australia mustn't be left out of the British political community, and that Australia is formed from the same culture and traditions, and shares a heritage with Britain that mustn't be forgotten. Yeah.
So Menzies gives this speech, doesn't he, at Chatham House to the Royal Institute of International Affairs, called "Australia's Place in Empire." It's such an interesting speech, and you've got diary entries too, don't you, and his reflections of his own performance at the speech and how he prepared for it. But why was this speech so significant?
It reveals a tension in his. So Judith Brett talks about this in The Forgotten People. The address reveals a tension in his relationship with England that perhaps has been overlooked, or was, I think, overlooked before Brett's book and probably overlooked since. And he has this sort of revelation that perhaps not everyone in England sees Australia in the same way that he views England. And this speech forms part of a sort of effort for him to articulate the necessity of Australia's inclusion and what Australia has to offer. And there's a deeper sense that if for Menzies, that if England doesn't acknowledge this rich tradition, then really what is England and what is that community? And the important thing about Menzies' appeals to his English audience are that we can perhaps read in them that there's the anxieties that Menzies has, they exist in mainstream Australia, and he's kind of positioning himself as a representative of Australian people. It's not just Menzies alone in England arguing for greater participation and sort of not to be left behind or forgotten. I think Menzies estimates, based on his reading of the public mood in Australia, that that these concerns have a wide basis in reality.
I mean, he says, doesn't he, that the thing which sticks firmly in the mind of the average Australian is that he is entirely British, and he does not understand what the discussion is about when one tries to demonstrate that he is not. But he's obviously getting a sense the reception he gets in Britain is that there is that they view Australians as completely separate, and there's even a sense from some that Australians are sort of a second-rate British subject and not even of the same kind of calibre as the British, which must have been deeply troubling to him.
Yeah, and I think that's formed through Menzies' upbringing and experience of living in regional Victoria and then in Melbourne. And even though these places are fiercely loyal to the empire, there's still this sense that because of Australia's sort of colonial past or convict heritage and distance from Europe, as well as the speed with which Australia's kind of been established, that it doesn't have this kind of culture and tradition that Britain has. It's an interesting thing to grapple with, because I think the extent of this anxiety might be more based in Australia than perhaps it really is in England. There's not much that I've read where English people are saying this directly. It's kind of a paranoia that people have here, but Menzies certainly feels it. And then arriving at England at that age of 40, having this preconception about what England is, to then sort of find, he does find that the trade interests are moving away from the empire, and perhaps the short-term interests of what's good for Britain at that time aren't aligning with the Australian national interests. So that's all articulated in the speech, but people in Australia also have those concerns, and they're forming these sort of associations and citizens movements where they're in Australia, where they're arguing for greater English leadership in the League of Nations, and for greater facilitation of travel between Britain and Australia and elsewhere in the empire. So I think the thing that really struck me about Menzies' John Citizen speech at Chatham is I think he's attempting to articulate something on behalf of his constituency, and positioning himself to represent a Australian political environment where people see themselves as British as well.
Yeah. Tell me about this sort of rhetorical device of John Citizen. You write that it sort of presages the forgotten people that Menzies then goes on to very famously talk about in the 1940s.
Yeah, so I think there's a perhaps a view of Menzies that when he loses the first prime ministership, that it's a catalyst for his adjustment to a more appealing style of rhetoric. I think the John Citizen device shows us that far before Menzies, well, a few years before Menzies becomes prime minister, he's experimenting with ways of positioning himself as a popular representative of a kind of centre ground Australian political heartland. And he, it's like the man on the street, or the man on the omnibus
Clapham
who,
Omnibus, yeah.
yeah, uh, who might not know the intricacies of trade and foreign relations, and they're not attending the kind of public speaking engagements that Menzies is speaking at Chatham. However, they do have this set of kind of core values and concerns and customs and heritage that that Menzies is trying to position himself as saying that he understands. And in the speech where he's appealing to the people at Chatham to better understand what Australia is about, he's saying very clearly that although these people don't understand the intricacies of foreign relations, and they still see themselves as British, and they still have the same shared customs and cultural mores that people in Britain have. And I think it's really significant that he doesn't come up with the forgotten people overnight in 1942, and we can trace back through this speech and perhaps others that he's attempting to position himself as a popular representative and distance himself conceptually from a kind of elite.
Yeah. He is a representative of the everyday ordinary Australian who has a shared appreciation for freedom. I mean, he talks about the British prejudice for freedom, that Australians think freedom is their inherent right, and that also that John Citizen from Australia has a desire for peace, which in 1935, with the lead up to World War II, of course, causing a lot of strategic anxiety, Australians certainly, like the British, didn't want to have another World War One. They'd just come out of that and in the Great Depression. So those sort of, we are people, everyday people who share the same heritage, share the same appreciation for freedom, and share the same desire for peace, irrespective of where we live. We are of the same ilk. But
Yeah,
jo- Josh,
absolutely.
it's been a real pleasure to talk about your chapter. I'm really looking forward to the book launch, and it's been great to have you as part of the Menzies Early Career Network.
It's been a wonderful opportunity, and to work on something outside of my normal area has been really a really creative opportunity and a release. So I've really enjoyed it, and thank you very much.
Pleasure.